In general, people come to these talks to be exposed to new ideas, but sometimes these ideas conflict with existing beliefs, as I imagine will happen over the next 15 minutes. So there are a number of options you have at your disposal. You can accept the new beliefs because they're based on peer-reviewed research. You can decide to do additional investigation on your own, or you can reject the ideas outright. The latter is most common for people whose beliefs are truthy. Truthiness is a word that was coined by Stephen Colbert. It's when you believe something so strongly in your gut that you reject empirical evidence to the contrary. So let's say you believe that the human body is capable of producing too much blood and that this presents a serious health risk that can best be remedied by a barber through the process of bloodletting. And when you appreciate that this practice persisted for over 2,000 years, you can recognize just how big a problem truthiness can be. So truthy ideas are not simply objectively wrong, they are also potentially dangerous as well. And this brings us to compulsory schooling and the ubiquitous and erroneous belief in its merits. So compulsory schooling has not been around since the dawn of time. In fact, it was invented in Prussia in the early 19th century. At that time, it was part of a process for producing good soldiers, which explains the emphasis on conformity and obedience to authority. In 1852, the concept was imported to the United States, where it was forced on the good people of Massachusetts. And I say forced because the National Guard had to be brought in to take children away from their parents 3 days a week for 4 hours a day. Now, at that time, the literacy rate in Massachusetts was 97.2%. So compulsory schooling wasn't even introduced for the purpose of promoting literacy. At that time, it was envisioned that compulsory schools could be repurposed to promote egalitarianism. Now, the problem is not everything can be effectively repurposed. So, for example, a hammer is a perfectly wonderful tool, but you wouldn't want to repurpose it as a surgical instrument. Although here we see a doctor preparing a sedative. So, as we might expect, today compulsory schools have been repurposed for the point of promoting literacy, and the impact has been dismal. According to the Department of Education, only 37% of 12th graders have literacy skills proficient or better, and only 25% are proficient or better in math. Now, there is a way to dramatically improve test scores on students. All you have to do is remove the entire student body and replace it with children who have never been to school. Studies show that students who have never been to school score 34 percentile points higher than students who are educated at compulsory schools. To appreciate why this is the case, I'd like you all to do a little thought experiment. I'd like you to imagine that you are a political prisoner in North Korea, and the supreme leader wants you to go through re-education, and the re-education process requires that you read Moby Dick and Huck Finn. With me so far? So your release is contingent on passing a test on these works. So how do you prepare? Naturally, you're not going to read the books in any sort of organic way where the content has any meaning for you. You're going to want to read them with an eye towards guessing what kinds of responses the supreme leader is going to want to hear. So after many years in captivity, you take the test, and let's say you pass the test, and you're released. How do you think you'll respond? Well, most likely you will come to hate these works. You will detest them because they remind you of your experiences in captivity. You may come to detest literature altogether and just not read. In addition, you will likely forget the contents because either as an act of conscious resistance or because you just don't want to think about the text because they remind you of your incarceration. Lastly, your relationship to figures of authority will also be tainted. You will come to resent and detest and fear people and figures in authority, but at the same time, because of your conditioning, you may also be subservient and docile. I don't know if any of this sounds familiar to you, but it certainly sounded awfully familiar to the myriad of students that I've interviewed over the years. And the reason for this is because there are certain features that are universal to all compulsory schools. All compulsory schools have a hierarchical structure with students at the bottom, powerless to control the basic things that affect their lives. Second, all dissent is suppressed. And these features aren't even under dispute. They're recognized, they're acknowledged. You can't run a classroom unless you have a docile student body who takes orders in obedient fashion. So these features are presented as being for the benefit of the students. Well, political scientists have a term for this type of construct. It's called benevolent despotism. Now, most people don't like to think of their community school as being despotic, but that doesn't change the features, the fact that they are, and that there are consequences to this kind of environment. Another feature that's universal to all compulsory schools is that the students are in a state of captivity. Now, research scientists have identified a number of features of what constitutes captivity. Basically, when a population has been removed from their preferred locale and placed in a new one where their movements are profoundly restricted and they have limited expectations for privacy because they're routinely under observation, and taming occurs where their desire for escape is attenuated. To appreciate the effects and impacts of captivity, I'd like to introduce you to Gus. Gus is a polar bear who lived in the Central Park Zoo in New York City. When Gus was 9 years old, he began swimming back and forth compulsively in his tank for 12 hours a day, every day. Well, zoo officials knew that this was a response to the stress and boredom of captivity, so they intervened, and they decided to try to introduce novelty, and so they completely redesigned his habitat and introduced toys, but it didn't help. So they decided to bring in an animal behaviorist to try to boost Gus' self-esteem. Didn't help. So then they realized the problem must be that Gus's life lacks meaning. So they decided to introduce challenges during mealtime to simulate the hunt. Didn't help. So they fed Gus a diet of Prozac, and the symptoms diminished but never quite went away. But Gus is not unique. Many animals in zoos are fed Valium, and birds are fed Haldol so they don't pluck out all their feathers. Well, just like Gus and the animals in the zoo, over 8 million children in public schools are given prescription drugs to help them cope with the environment or to help teachers cope with them. And just like Gus, you can spend millions and millions of dollars of upgrading the schools, introducing the best computer equipment, improving the physical plant. You can eliminate all testing. You can bring in all the best teachers and all the best administrators. You can introduce challenges during mealtime. And none of these will impact the fact that the students are still in a state of captivity. And here's what we know about captivity. Captivity causes chronic stress, and chronic stress causes the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. And cortisol permanently kills brain cells and inhibits the growth of new ones. Research tells us other things about compulsory school environment. Compulsory school environment induces learned helplessness, anxiety, depression. It also inhibits creativity and inhibits empathy. Now, it's very common, I know, for people to say, well, I went to compulsory school and I'm okay. But first, that's anecdotal. And second, the threshold for what is considered okay is profoundly low. I'd like to leave you with one last piece of research, and that comes from the Centers for Disease Control. 1 in 6 high school students seriously consider suicide, and 1 in 12 has made an attempt on their own life. So if you're a teacher looking out on an average classroom, of roughly 24 students. On average, 4 of those students are seriously considering killing themselves, and 2 of them have tried. Now, here's the good news. There is something that you can do. You can take your kids out of school. Schools are not constructive places for children. I know that it's common for people to say, well, I went to compulsory school and I'm okay. And that is truthiness. Thank you.